Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we experience the world through our senses, right? Well, today we're going to be focusing on one in particular, touch. And we're going way beyond just feeling. We're diving deep into the fascinating world of mechanoreceptors.
Ah, yes. The often unsung heroes of sensation.
Seriously. I mean, these tiny sensors, they're constantly at work, you know, converting all that physical stuff in the world into like this symphony of sensations in our brains.
They really are quite remarkable.
Okay, so think about this for a sec. How do we actually know the difference, say, between a gentle caress and then like a really firm handshake?
That's a great question.
Or even like, how do we manage to navigate a room in the dark without, bumping into absolutely everything?
That's where our friends, the mechanoreceptors, come into play. They're these specialized nerve cells, and they respond to like mechanical pressure or,
Right.
distortion.
Okay, so they're like what, tiny antennas then, picking up signals?
Exactly. Perfectly put. Tuned to the language of touch and vibration and pressure, constantly sending messages to your brain.
Okay, so they're located all over our body, right? Not just like in our skin.
You got it.
I was reading this article called Unlocking the Mysteries of Mechanoreceptors, the Hidden Sensors of Our Bodies. It was saying that they're even in our internal organs.
Absolutely. You see, while we tend to associate mechanoreceptors with our sense of touch on the surface, they actually play a super vital role in tons of different bodily functions too. For instance, they help regulate blood pressure in our arteries, and even tell our lungs when it's time to breathe.
Wow. So it's way more than just like feeling the world around us then. It's about our bodies, like understanding what's going on inside too.
Exactly. It's like an internal communication system, keeping everything running smoothly.
That's amazing. Now, the article I mentioned, it talks about like four main types of mechanoreceptors. So what makes them different from each other?
Good question. Each type is uniquely designed to respond to a particular, kind of stimuli. Let's start with Merkel cells. They're slow adapting receptors, which means they'll keep sending signals as long as a stimulus is present. So they're perfect for sensing like fine details and textures are really concentrated in our fingertips. That's how we can appreciate, the smoothness of silk or like the roughness of sandpaper.
Okay, so whenever I'm trying to thread a needle, I can thank my Merkel cells for, finally getting that thread through. But
Exactly.
what about those like quick light touches when you feel like a fly land on your arm?
Ah, that's where Meissner's corpuscles step in. They're rapidly adapting receptors, meaning they respond quickly to changes in stimuli, but then they stop firing if the stimulus stays constant. This makes them perfect for detecting like light touch and vibrations, those subtle movements that other receptors might miss.
Gotcha. So it's like they're designed to pick up on changes in movement then rather than just like constant pressure. Okay, so we've got Merkel cells, those are the detail-oriented ones, and then Meissner's corpuscles, they're like the motion detectors. Now, what about when you need to feel something more intense, like a deep tissue massage? Is there a specific mechanoreceptor for that?
Absolutely. Deep down in the skin, we have these things called Pacinian corpuscles. They're rapidly adapting too, but they're much larger and way more sensitive to high frequency vibrations and deep pressure.
So like when you're feeling the rumble of a passing train or like that thudding bass at a concert?
You got it. They're also responsible for like that sensation of vibrations traveling through objects. Like when you tap a wooden table, you can feel those vibrations in your fingertips.
Okay, so far we've got the detail specialists, then the motion detectors, and now the vibration sensors. So what about that fourth type? What's their specialty?
Well, the fourth type is called Ruffini endings. Now, these guys are slow adapting receptors, but they're sensitive to skin stretch and, sustained pressure. They hang out in the deeper layers of the skin, and they're super important for our sense of proprioception.
Proprioception. So that's like our sense of where our body is in space,
Hmm.
right? Like when you can touch your nose with your eyes closed.
Bingo.
But how do Ruffini endings actually, contribute to that?
That's a great question. Unlike the other mechanoreceptors we've been talking about, which are concentrated in, specific areas, Ruffini endings are spread out over larger areas of the skin.
Yeah.
This allows them to like detect stretching and changes in skin tension over a wider area, which is super important for, understanding the position and movement of our limbs.
So while the other mechanoreceptors are busy giving us all this information about the outside world, Ruffini endings are more focused on our internal map, like
Yeah,
telling our brains where our body parts are in relation to each other.
exactly. It's like having an internal GPS system.
That's so cool. It's like easy to just completely overlook how much we rely on this sense. But now that you mention it, it kind of makes you wonder, like, How do these mechanoreceptors actually get this information up to the brain? It's not like they have tiny wires connecting them.
Correct. Well, not wires exactly, but there's definitely a super complex communication system going on there. When a mechanoreceptor is stimulated, it triggers a whole cascade of events that ultimately generate an electrical signal.
So it's like this chain reaction then.
Yeah, think of it that way. That mechanical force gets converted into an electrical impulse that travels along nerve fibers, first to the spinal cord and then up to the brain, where it gets interpreted as a specific sensation.
Wow, it's just amazing how our bodies can translate these physical forces into electrical signals that our brains can actually make sense of. But there's still so much more to unpack. Like, how does the brain know the difference between, say, a light touch and then deep pressure, or between a vibration and a stretch?
Right.
And what about the role of mechanoreceptors in things like, I don't know, pain perception or even emotional experiences? I guess those are all questions we'll have to say for our next segment, though.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to explore. Stay tuned.
So much to discover. Okay, so last time we were talking about how our brains can tell the difference between all these different signals coming from our mechanoreceptors, right?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So it's not just about identifying the type of touch, but also where it is, how intense it is, and even its emotional meaning.
It's like a whole sensory symphony the brain is conducting. It's really remarkable.
Okay, so you mentioned the brain knows how to differentiate between the different types of touch. But how does it actually know if a signal's coming from, say, a Merkel cell versus a Pacinian corpuscle?
Well, think of it this way. Each type of mechanoreceptor basically has its own dedicated pathway to the brain.
Okay, so different lanes on a highway, each one carrying information from a specific, type of receptor.
Got it. It's a pretty efficient system.
So that lets the brain process all this information from the different receptors, all at the same time.
Exactly. That's how we get such a nuanced understanding of what we're feeling.
But how does the brain actually figure out how intense the touch is? Is it just about how many signals it's getting?
It's a little more complicated than that, actually. The frequency and the pattern of the signals, that matters too.
Okay.
Like a gentle touch might trigger a few signals per second, right? But then a firm grip could send this whole burst of signals really fast.
So the brain looks at the quantity of signals, but then also the rhythm and the timing of them too.
Precisely.
It's like a whole code the brain has to figure out.
Yeah. And this code can be incredibly detailed. It can even tell us about those subtle variations in texture and pressure and movement. That's how we can tell the difference between a hug, the brush of a feather, or a handshake.
Speaking of hugs, earlier we were talking about how mechanoreceptors can actually be involved in our emotional responses too.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? How can something that's purely physical trigger an emotional reaction?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. And there's still so much we're learning about it.
Yeah.
But we do know that certain types of touch can actually activate specific areas in the brain, areas associated with pleasure and comfort and social bonding. For example, there are studies that have shown that when you gently stroke the skin, that can release oxytocin.
Oh, wow. Oxytocin. That's like the cuddle hormone, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It gets that nickname because it plays such a big role in promoting feelings of love and connection.
So it's not just about feeling the physical touch, but it's about all those hormonal and neural responses that it can set off. It's like our sense of touch is directly connected to our emotions.
It really is. And this connection is so important for our well-being,
Yeah.
socially and emotionally. Think about how vital touch is for little kids as they're developing. Infants, they thrive on physical contact, right? And it plays a key role in how they develop emotionally and socially.
It's true. I remember reading somewhere that babies who get held and touched regularly, they tend to be calmer and cry less.
Yeah.
And they even bond better with whoever is taking care of them.
Absolutely. And this need for touch, it doesn't go away as we get older.
Right.
Think about hugging someone you care about, or holding hands with your partner, or even just a friendly pat on the back. Those are all ways that we're using touch to communicate,
Yeah.
and reinforce those social bonds.
It's like a language of comfort and connection,
Yeah.
one that we can understand without saying a word.
Exactly.
But it's not always positive, right?
Yeah.
What about when we feel pain? How are mechanoreceptors involved in that?
Well, pain, that's a really complex sensation. It's not just one thing, right? But our mechanoreceptors definitely play an important role. Certain mechanoreceptors, these ones called nociceptors, they're specifically designed to detect any stimuli that could be harmful. So things like extreme pressure or temperature or, chemical irritants.
So like the body's alarm system then, letting us know when something is wrong.
Precisely. They're the ones saying, hey, pay attention. You need to do something.
When they get activated, those nociceptors send pain signals up to the brain, right?
Right. And that pain response is critical for our survival because it motivates us to get out of dangerous situations and protect ourselves from getting hurt even worse.
It's like when you touch a hot stove.
Right.
The pain is what tells you to pull your hand away as fast as you can.
Exactly. It prevents a much worse burn.
But what about chronic pain? The kind that sticks around even after the injury is healed. That's different.
Yeah. Chronic pain is a whole other story. And the role of mechanoreceptors there is still a bit of a mystery. But some research suggests that sometimes mechanoreceptors can become like super sensitive or start sending, kind of messed up signals to the brain, and that can lead to those persistent pain sensations.
So it's possible that it's not just the initial injury itself, but how the nervous system is actually interpreting those signals from the mechanoreceptors.
Yeah, that's one of the theories. And it's something that researchers are looking into.
Right.
Because if we can understand how mechanoreceptors contribute to chronic pain, that could help us develop better treatments.
To help people who are really suffering.
Exactly.
It's incredible how these tiny little sensors are involved in so many different experiences, from, feeling a really subtle texture to the intense sensation of pain. Makes you realize how much we take our sense of touch for granted.
It really is a remarkable sense, and we're only beginning to really understand all the ways it works.
So we've talked about how mechanoreceptors help us figure out the physical world around us and how they're part of our emotional experiences too. What about like the future? Are there ways we could use this knowledge, in things like medicine or technology?
Oh, absolutely. There's this whole field called mechanobiology. It's all about how cells and tissues respond to mechanical forces. It's a really exciting and rapidly developing area of research. For example, some scientists are exploring ways to actually use mechanoreceptors to create prosthetic limbs that can feel,
Oh,
so they could provide that sensory feedback to the user.
that would be incredible. It would completely change the game for amputees.
Absolutely. It would allow them to interact with the world so much more naturally, more intuitively.
What other potential applications are scientists working on?
Another really promising area is developing new therapies for chronic pain by specifically targeting those mechanoreceptors. If we can really understand how they become more sensitive or start malfunctioning, then we might be able to develop drugs or other interventions that can actually reduce or even completely eliminate those pain signals.
It's amazing to think that something as tiny as these sensors could hold the key to relieving suffering and improving so many people's lives.
It really speaks to the power of scientific inquiry and, the incredible potential of the human body to heal and adapt.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From how mechanoreceptors basically work to how they're involved in pain and emotional experiences. But I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We really have. There's always more to learn.
So in our next segment, we'll dive into some of the bigger implications of how we rely on mechanoreceptors, and how they actually shape our whole understanding of the world around us.
Some really interesting stuff. Stay tuned.
So we've been on this journey, exploring the world of these mechanoreceptors.
Quite a world.
And it's amazing to think, right, from those like very first moments when a baby feels their mom's touch, all the way to those like really intricate movements of a dancer. These tiny things are shaping our whole experience.
It really shows you how fundamental touch is to, like, the whole human experience. We talk about sight and hearing being, those dominant senses. But touch, that's our first language, really.
Yeah, and, it made me think about something you said before about the brain creating this internal map of our body based on all those signals from the mechanoreceptors. It's like our sense of self, Like our physical self in the world, it's built on all those constant messages.
That's a great point. And it does raise some pretty interesting questions, like what happens when those sensations get all messed up?
Yeah, like what happens then?
If our sense of self is tied to those physical sensations, what happens when they're like altered or disrupted?
Right. And I've read about people who've lost their sense of touch, because of nerve damage and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like super disorienting for them.
It makes sense.
It's like losing this basic connection to the world and even to their own bodies.
It goes even beyond the physical, too,
Yeah.
because our sense of touch, it's tied to our emotions, how we feel about ourselves and others. Think about, like, the power of a hug or even a handshake, you know?
Right.
They can communicate empathy and comfort and connection.
It's powerful.
And when we can't connect that way, it can really impact our relationships and, make us feel isolated.
It's like we forget that our senses, they're not just about taking in information, right?
Yeah.
They're shaping our whole experience, our relationships. They even shape how we see ourselves.
It's all connected. And we often take our sense of touch for granted. It lets us experience the world, with all its richness and complexity.
It really is a gift. And it's fascinating how all this research is kind of blurring the lines, between biology and psychology, even technology. Like we were talking about prosthetics that can actually feel.
Yeah. And there are researchers looking at using touch in virtual reality too, to make it more immersive.
It's wild. Like, what if one day we could create these virtual worlds that we can see and hear and feel too?
It really makes you think, right? What other sensory experiences might we be able to recreate or even enhance in the future? It's amazing.
Totally. And it all comes back to those tiny sensors, those mechanoreceptors doing their thing, connecting us to the physical world.
They're the unsung heroes, really.
Well, we've covered so much. We started out exploring how these, tiny sensors work, and now we're talking about the nature of perception, our connection to everything around us.
It's been quite a deep dive.
It really has, and I hope it makes people think a bit more about their own sense of touch. To appreciate all those, subtle things we feel every day, the pressure and the texture and the temperature.
The moment, right? The next time you feel a breeze or the warmth of someone's hand.
Think about all those amazing sensations your mechanoreceptors are creating. It's a reminder of how powerful our senses are, how they shape us, how they connect us to the world.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up, don't you? Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Absolutely. Keep exploring and keep feeling. We'll see you next time.